Okay, then let's start. So when you join the webinar, you'll have noticed that this control panel pops up on the right-hand side of the screen. If it's getting in the way of the slides, you can collapse it using that orange button. To view the webinar in full screen, you just use that button. And to ask a question, or if you're having problems seeing or hearing the webinar, you can let us know via the chat box at the bottom of the control panel. All right, to begin with, can I just make sure that everyone can see the slide on screen and can also hear my voice? You can let me know using the chat box at the bottom. Yeah, all seems good there. If you are having problems connecting or with the quality of the video or the audio, changing the browser might help. So if you're using Edge and you're having some problems, try using the same link in Chrome or vice versa. All right, so hello everybody, welcome and thank you for joining us for this training webinar on the new features of IBIS version 3.2. We've had IBIS users register from almost 60 countries, so thank you for your interest. I understand it's quite early in the morning for some of you and towards the end of the day for others, and it's just past 1 p.m. here in Ireland where I'm speaking to you from. My name is Brian Leahy, and I'm the training content designer and senior trainer with Ultra Forensic Technology. So today we're going to be covering the new features of the latest software upgrade of IBIS, which is version 3.2. As we go through the webinar, please feel free to ask any questions that you have in the chat box as you think of them. Peter Zenkovic is joining us from Montreal, and he's going to keep an eye on the questions that come up. At the end, I'll do my best to answer as many of them as time allows. So the plan is that the webinar will last about 45 minutes with some extra time for your questions. So we'll try and get you out of here within the hour. And also today's session is being recorded and will be made available online for those who are unable to join us today. So what we're going to cover today are the new features of the latest version of IBIS software, version 3.2. The match point is going to take up the lion's share of the webinar, as there are some pretty big changes to correlation scores. We'll introduce normalized scores and the new unified score. We'll talk about the improvements in correlation performance, as well as some of the additional functionality in the matchpoint application, such as extra columns, the order of images in the multiviewer, hit context, hit markup, stuff like that. On brass tracks, there are a few application changes to be aware of. There's a new exhibit reception date field that we'll look at. We'll see how the elliptical firing pin shape name has changed. There's an image quality check that detects vibration. And there's some new features on exporting and getting reports on the brass tracks. We'll also draw attention to some new firing pin shapes that have been causing a little confusion. We're going to address some of the new features that are unique to bullet tracks also. It's probably worth mentioning at this point that the new features on brass tracks and bullet tracks, they relate to version 3.2 Service Pack 1. So while the match point features we're going to address are present on all systems running version 3.2, your brass tracks and bullet tracks may need that extra service pack that is currently being rolled out. Okay, so the list of features in this webinar, it's not exhaustive. So as always, we're just covering the main topics. If you want to get a full guide to the new release, the release notes of the software, that'll be available under the help menu in your application. And you'll get a PDF of the release notes, which explains every new feature. Just below the release notes here in the About Matchpoint option, that'll tell you exactly which version you're running. So if you're running version 3.2 or 3.2.1, etc., that's where you'll find it out. All right, so let's start with a quick poll question. So the question is, have you taken the online tutorial on the correlation review changes that is available on our e-learning platform? Or maybe you weren't aware of it. I'm going to pause my microphone for just a second and I'll come back when we get the results. Okay, so we can see there from the results that just under half have not taken the, oh, sorry, a little bit more than that. Maybe 3/4 haven't taken the tutorial. 30% were unaware of it, and a quarter of you have done. So for those quarter of you who have done that tutorial, this is going to basically build on what you covered in that. Okay, so let's get into the match point then. So if you're running version 3.1 or even earlier versions than that, your correlation results currently look like this. So you've got 6 score columns with scores in the hundreds or the tens, and then on the left you've got this rank sort column which takes all of those score columns into account and ranks the test exhibits accordingly. So this should be familiar to anybody who has used Matchpoint at any stage over the last few years. Now, once upgraded to version 3.2, however, things look a little different. Now, for starters, at the beginning, there's just one score column, the unified score, and all our scores are decimalized here. Now, it's important to note is the rank column and the individual score columns haven't just completely disappeared, they're hidden. And we can get them back by right-clicking on the column header. That takes us into the column selection tool, so we can select, for example, the rank, and that brings back the rank column. We can go back into that column selector and then choose to show all of the 2D and 3D score columns that we're used to seeing. Now, it's quite possible that you will want to do this the first time you logged in. Now, even with all those score columns displayed, things are still quite different as we've got these decimal values appearing everywhere. Now we're going to look at where those decimal values come from. All right, so the scores that we've been familiar with up to now, so those values in the tens or the hundreds, they're called native scores. And the new decimal values are called normalized scores. So a native score is a value assigned to a similarity by the correlation algorithm for a particular image type. So here, for example, in the exhibit ranked third by rank sort, there was a native score of 54 for breech face sidelight. There's a 72 for firing pin 2D and a native score of 310 for firing pin 3D. Now these scores allow the test results to be ranked for that image type, but the number itself has no significance outside that column. There's no standardization between columns, so that score of 72 doesn't really mean anything outside the context of the firing pin 2D column. Now, if you still want to see native scores for correlations, the way to do that now is via the correlation results selection screen, which you can access by right-clicking on the correlation request in the upper pane and selecting correlation results selection. That feature was previously called correlation results filtering. Now that opens a screen which gives you the graphical representation of all of the results for all score columns. And to view native scores, what you want to do is use the checkbox on the right there. So let me just zoom in so you can see that checkbox right there, show native scores. That's going to show you native scores here. Now, it's worth bearing in mind that in version 3.2, the native scores are 10 times what they were previously. So scores in the thousands are now quite common. So where you had maybe 341 previously, you now have 3,410. Okay, now normalized scores are more meaningful. They're always rounded to 2 decimal places. So for example, 1.85, 1.96, 7.49. All columns are scored in the same standardized range, and normalization takes place across the entire sample size. Now, if we look at a correlation request, on the far right column there, the number in the sample size column tells us the total number of exhibits that reference exhibit was correlated against. Okay, so just to talk about sample size briefly, consider the following reference exhibit. So a 9mm Luger, firing pin shape of circle, test fire terminated, category with an occurrence date of June 8th, 2020. So the database is screened as follows. First of all, only the 9mm auto caliber family and unknown calibers are retained for correlation. Similarly, only exhibits with circular and unknown firing pin shapes are retained. And then finally, only crime exhibits with occurrence dates before June 8th, 2020 are kept. And basically, it's the intersection of that Venn diagram there. That is the total number of exhibits that satisfy those parameters. That's the sample size. So in this example, the sample size is 298, which basically means out of the entire database, 298 exhibits were correlated against our test-fired 9mm cartridge case. So what happens next is that these 298 exhibits are correlated with the reference exhibit, and native scores for all image types are calculated and then normalized. So what do those normalized scores mean? Now, a native score that is extraordinarily high relative to other scores in that column is normalized to a high value. Now, we're only looking here at 10 results rather than the entire 298, but this will give us an indication of what's happening. In this example, the breech face 3D score of 4,268 is very high relative to other scores in that column, and it's normalized to 7.49, which separates it from the pack. Now, that's an example of a high normalized score. On the other hand, a native score that is similar to other scores in the column normalizes to a low value. So in this example here, the firing pin 3D score of 1,437, that's within a mass of similar scores in that column. So there are some higher scores like 1906 and 1663. But there's also some lower scores like 1146, 1246. And that 1,437, that normalizes to 1.24, which is not a standout score by any means. A native score that falls outside the top 100 for that column is deemed as statistically insignificant, and it is assigned a value of 0.00. Now, in this example here, for the breech face side light score, the score of 432 is outside the top 100 for that column, and it's given a score of 0.00. Now, this appears as a dash in the results because the results pane would otherwise be cluttered up with a bunch of 0.00s. Okay, so when you see that dash, what it means is that for that particular image type, that exhibit did not rank in the top 100. A score of NA means that the image was not acquired. So an NA would for example, could be that the ejector mark was not acquired for a particular exhibit, or maybe some older exhibits don't have 3D firing pin and breech face images. Okay. Now that all of the columns are scored on a standardized range, they can be easily combined into a single unified score that will work in the same way as rank sort. Now, the unified score is more meaningful than rank sort because it represents the overall similarity of a correlation result relative to the others, and it can be used as the only sorting column. So really, all we need is the unified score. Okay, so when it comes to interpreting these results, the normalized scores and the unified scores, they're plotted on a logarithmic scale. So that means that each whole number has a magnitude of 10 times the previous whole number. So it's very similar to the Richter scale for earthquakes, where an earthquake of 7.0 has 10 times the magnitude of a 6.0. And likewise, in the exhibit on the left here, the top score of 3.16, that represents a similarity more than 10 times stronger than the second ranked exhibit, which had a unified score of 2.02. Now, the more data you have, the better the normalization process works. However, if the sample size is less than 250, there are not enough data points to normalize the scores. Now, small sample sizes will happen with uncommon calibers or in regions where not a lot of data has been entered into IBIS. Now, I would expect that every lab is going to come across correlation requests that are working with small sample sizes from time to time. In this example, the sample size is 112. Now, what happens in this scenario is the native scores are generated as usual, and for each column, the normalized scores are calculated as follows. For each column, the top ranked score is assigned a normalized score of 2.00. Second is 1.70, and third is 1.52, and so on and so on and so on, as you can see here for these results that are sorted by breach face 3D. So we don't get those big scores of 5 point something or 7 point something that we saw earlier. Those values of 2.00 and 1.70 and 1.52 are calculated using this formula. So an exhibit's normalized score for a score column is equal to 2.00 minus log to base 10 of the rank. So for the top ranked exhibit in a score column, it's 2.00 minus the log to base 10 of 1, which is 2 minus 0, which gives us that 2.00. For the second place, it's 2 minus log to base 10 of 2, which gives us this, which gives us 1.7, and so on and so on and so on. Now, you don't really need to know the mathematics of where these scores come from, but for those of you who were curious, there you have it. So basically, the process still standardizes the scores across all your columns, and the unified score is still generated, albeit it's much lower than those for larger sample sizes. So an exhibit that ranked first for multiple score columns will have scores of 2.00 in multiple columns, and it could be a very, very strong match, but those columns will combine to give a unified score of maybe 2.2 or 2.3, something like that. Okay, so to illustrate just how those scores vary with sample size, I've taken the following example. So on screen here, we have two sister exhibits. Both are 32 auto, both have circular firing pins, exhibit CC1 and exhibit 025. 025 is CBC branded ammunition, so it has this pre-stamped primer that can contaminate the breech face signature and confuse things a little bit. But there looks like there's great, it looks like there's great agreement in the firing pin, and the ejector mark also looks pretty similar. Okay, to begin with, what we did is we correlated CC1 with a small sample size of just 38 exhibits. So if we look here, we have 38 exhibits in our sample size. Now CC1 correlated with that database, and 025, as our exhibit, came up in first position. You can see the unified score was 2.34. We had normalized scores of 2.00 for firing pin 2D, for ejector, and also for firing pin 3D. So they combined to give that unified score of 2.34, which is not a huge amount higher than the 2.20 in second place. Okay, so then what we did is we correlated in a slightly bigger pool. So this time with a sample size of 353 exhibits. Here again, exhibit 025 came out on top, but this time it was able to separate itself from the pack with a unified score of 6.73, much higher than the second place 2.47. We can see from the individual normalized score columns that that firing pin 2D was the big difference maker, scoring much, much better than any of the other 352 samples for that image. And firing pin 3D also scored quite well. Okay, and then finally, we ran the correlation against a sample size of 1,162 exhibits. So remember now, all 1,162 exhibits, they're still 32 auto, they're still circular firing pins. And this time CC1 found exhibit 025 in first position again, but this time the unified score was 16.28, which is several times higher than the 3.5 of the second ranked exhibit. So the two exhibits didn't change, their images didn't change, only the sample size grew. So that goes to show that the more data points in your correlation, the better that potential matching exhibits can separate themselves from the pack using normalized and unified scores. Okay, so when you do get your correlation results back, there are three options for displaying the results in the side-by-side and the multiviewer. And they're selected using the radio buttons at the top of the results pane. So we'll start with the one on the right here and we'll move to the left. So starting with all results, as the name suggests, it basically displays all exhibits that returned a score. So in this example here, you can see 212 exhibits returned a score, and that's how many exhibits would be loaded into the viewers. Next is the top 10 best scored results column. Here, that gives us the top 10 exhibits plus ties for each score column. It gives us, in this example, 48 exhibits to be reviewed in multiviewer or side-by-side viewer. Now, it's important to note that this result set only applies to displayed columns. So in order for it to work on all scores, all the individual score columns need to be displayed. Applying it when only the unified score column is shown will give you just 10 results. Now that number 10 in this example, that can be changed in your preferences to top 20, top 15, or whatever the lab protocol is where you are. And then finally on the left, the unified score above 1.20 displays only exhibits with a unified score above 1.20. In this example, that amounted to 29 exhibits for viewing. Now that threshold value of 1.20 was selected as it showed better or similar correlation performance to using the top 20 best scored results in version 3.1. It is the default value, but it can be changed in preferences. So lowering that threshold value, you'll see more exhibits, and raise it and you'll see fewer. However, we would recommend if you have been using a top 10 or a top 20 best scored results set that you continue doing so. After some time, an appropriate threshold value for your data can be determined. Just a quick note on bullet tracks. So everything we've covered so far regarding correlation also applies to bullet correlations. So scores are normalized. Bullet results also now have unified scores that make it much easier to see potential matches and for matches to separate themselves from the pack. The only difference is that for bullets, that default value is 0.80, that threshold value for your unified scores. Okay, so it's time for another poll question. This time we're asking, how do you carry out your correlation reviews? Do you tend to use the multiviewer? Do you tend to use side-by-side viewer only? Do you tend to use a combination of the two? Okay, so I'm going to mute again and I will be back when I see these results. Okay, so some interesting results there. So about 1 in 5 people don't review correlation results, but 1 in 3 people use side-by-side only. But more than that, use a combination of multiviewer and side-by-side with 44%. All right, so taking a look at what the new scores and the new correlation results mean for our viewers. If you use the side-by-side viewer, it can be used in exactly the same way as before. The unified score replaces the rank sort, and as we've seen, unified score gives a more meaningful score that indicates the overall similarity. You've got your correlation tab on the right-hand side, which always shows the biggest contributing score. So if I zoom in here, we can see that this ranked #1 overall, and then it drills down into the individual scores and it tells us why that was the case. So highlighted in red here was the main contributor to that unified score, Breachface 3D. So that would indicate maybe Breachface 3D is a good place to start in terms of reviewing the results there. Okay. For those of you who use the Multiviewer, it works in the same way as before also. So your exhibits can be sorted by the individual score columns, if that's what you did previously, or by the unified score. The unified score appears at the bottom of each column representing one exhibit, and then your individual normalized scores for a particular image type, they appear in the top right-hand corner of each thumbnail. So whether you like to do a first pass on correlation results using the Multiviewer or jump straight into the side-by-side, you don't need to change your review method because of version 3.2, unless of course you want to. All right, so let's move on to some of the other new features of Matchpoint. As well as the changes we've just seen about how the results are presented, the correlation performance has been significantly improved for every score. Now these graphs show the improvement between version 3.1 in orange and version 3.2 in blue. So for this one, for example, 9mm, top 1, basically, this is how often a known match appears in first position, how often it appears in the top 10, how often it appears in the top 20. So you can see there's been an improvement. Likewise for 380, there's been a big improvement here. And for 45 auto, we can see those improvements as well. A correlation validation study with all the details and all the data behind these graphs is currently nearing completion, and it will be published as soon as it's ready. And this study could help you refine your correlation review protocols in your lab as well. In addition to this, there is now increased separation between similar and dissimilar exhibits. So those similar exhibits are much better able to separate themselves from the rest of your results. And also the effect of off-center firing pin outlines has been eliminated. Okay, in terms of the correlation request window, there are some extra columns now available. So in the upper pane, we have case occurrence date, case supervisor, and originating agency reference, which can be displayed in the correlation request window. And then in the lower results pane, your case occurrence date and the case comments can be displayed. Now again, these columns can be displayed, they can be hidden, the order in which things appear can be completely moved around and customized using the column selector tool, which we saw previously. All right, so the next feature is one that had been requested by several different users. And it's now possible to change the order of images in Multiviewer. Now this might be of interest to those, the 44% of you who do like to use Multiviewer as a first step in your correlation reviews. Now on screen here, we have the default image order that we've all become familiar with for years. So from top to bottom, what you see is you see breach face ring light, you see breach face ring light, breach face side light, firing pin 2D, primer all in focus, and so on and so on. So it's now possible to change the order so that images favored by the user are promoted towards the top of the Multiviewer. Now this customization on the Multiviewer, that can be done using preferences under Tools menu. Images that you don't find useful can be hidden by selecting None. Now in this example here, the user has selected, they've customized the Multiviewer to display the full head stamp, then primer all in focus, primer depth grayscale, and ejector depth grayscale. All other images are hidden, as the user needs just these 4 images to do their first sweep on the correlation results. So they would do one pass across the test results and mark exhibits for elimination or for further comparison, whittling down further the number of exhibits to be reviewed in the side-by-side viewer. Okay, now the final new feature on Matchpoint that we're going to look at concerns hits. So basically, when a hit is created, all the side-by-side settings are saved with it. So that means that images, positions, rotations, hairline position, as well as image overlays and compositions, all the other controls that are present at the time are captured with the hit. Now, altogether, that is known as the hit context, and it is saved. So when you open a hit from the list, you are presented with exactly the conditions that were in place when that hit was created. Now you can manipulate those images and you can overwrite the hit context by selecting Save Hit Context in that drop-down menu there. Now, as well as that, you can also annotate hits by entering the hit markup mode, which is just below that in the drop-down. And that opens the hit markup toolbar from where it's possible to draw arrows and boxes and text on the hit. It works on the 2D images, and it's a pretty straightforward tool that works in the same way as most paint software. And those markups are saved in the hit context, and they can be displayed or hidden using the display guides there. Okay, so that kind of concludes the new features you can expect to see in Matchpoint version 3.2. In summary, we saw the normalized scores, where the correlation scores are now normalized across the entire sample size. The bigger, the better. The scores are standardized, always to 2 decimal places, and because of that, they can be combined into a unified score, which replaces the rank sort and provides a meaningful score that is the only one we need for correlation reviews. We saw there's been an improvement in correlation performance, and then we saw some other cosmetic improvements, such as more control over what columns appear, the order in which images can appear in the multiviewer, and the hit context and hit markup tools. All right, so that's the main kind of thrust of the webinar. That's the main part, the Matchpoint new features. There are a few changes on brass tracks and bullet tracks that we'll mention before we move on to your questions. Just to repeat that these are in version 3.2 Service Pack 1. So even though you're probably seeing unified scores on your Matchpoint, these new features might not be available until your next upgrade. So first up, the customization of columns that is possible on Matchpoint is also available on brass tracks. So you simply right-click on the column header and go to the column selection tool, where you can show, hide, and reorder your columns. This functionality is also available on bullet tracks. So you can kind of customize your workstations and make them less cluttered, or you can just basically see the information that you want to see. There have been some enhancements to how drop-down menus work. So when you're adding cases and exhibits, it makes it easier to find the item that you want to select. So first up, there's a search button. So you just type the first few characters of the item and that'll get you there. Recently used items appear at the top of the drop-down, followed by your preferred list, your preferred items there, and then the number of additional items which can be expanded at the bottom. Now these enhancements again are available in bullet tracks. The reception date field has been added to the Add Cartridge Case dialog box. Now this field enables you to enter the date that the exhibit was received by the agency responsible for IBIS entry. It facilitates tracking IBIS program metrics like turnaround times. So you can basically track the amount of time it takes for an exhibit to get from being entered into the agency to going into IBIS to having correlation results and so on and so forth. This reception date is also available in bullet tracks. It's not mandatory at the moment. Image quality check. So during image acquisition, an image quality check now takes place that detects if there are vibrations present. Now, depending on the quality of the images acquired, warnings or errors will appear on affected images in the validation screen, advising reacquisition if necessary. Okay, so you can see in this example on screen, it's just a warning saying that vibrations were detected, asking to ensure that the acquisition takes place without vibration, but it's not going to prevent any acquisitions being saved or anything like that. Next up is a name change for elliptical firing pin shapes. So we're talking here about firing pin impressions from exhibits fired from some Glocks, from Smith & Wesson Sigma, or from Springfield XDS 9mm pistols. Now we used to enter these with a firing pin shape of Glock, and about 5 years ago that changed to elliptical with Glock in brackets. Now the name is simply elliptical. The fact is that some Glock pistols now leave firing pin impressions that are very different from this shape, so it doesn't make sense to mention Glock in the firing pin shape. All your older exhibits will automatically be changed from Glock to elliptical, so you don't need to worry about it. Image export. Okay, so it's now possible to export 2D and 3D images without compression from a brass tracks to a folder or USB drive. So you simply navigate to the exhibit in the navigation tree and you right-click on that exhibit, selecting Export Images. Then you get this dialog box where you select the format. So you can select JP2 or X3P for 3D images. You click Export and the images will appear in the destination folder. So this is also possible with bullet exhibit images on bullet tracks. And lastly, it's now possible to generate statistical reports on a specific brass tracks. So previously a match point was needed to generate reports. So you simply click on the new report icon on the toolbar to launch the tool. You got standard templates which are available for the most common queries such as exhibits by caliber or exhibits acquired by user. And then on the custom tab to the right, you have the ability to build custom reports from scratch. Once the relevant report has been selected, date ranges and other parameters can be set for the report, which is processed as a PDF and is available under the Reports section of the navigation tree. And here is an example of a generated report. And of course, this tool is also available on bullet tracks. Okay, so moving on to bullet tracks, we'll look briefly at 3 features that are new in version 3.2. The first one is how, when using the compass controls, either the navigation compass or the microscope and tilt compass, keeping an outer arrow pressed will result in continuous movement in that direction. So for example, if you are using the bullet tracks that is not the new 2019 version, where the sensor starts a long way away from the bullet, pressing that lens down button there and keeping it pressed will move the sensor into position more quickly. For that new bullet tracks, which was released in 2019, the acquisition wizard has been enhanced. So there's now this green bullet tail limit indicator, which shows beyond which images will be cropped. There's also a continuous rotation button that allows for faster rotation. And there's other kind of regrouping has happened of particular tasks in the toolbar below the image view. So your pilot cameras and controls and your light controls and the redress and home position controls, they've all been grouped together in a way that makes a little bit more sense. And finally, on the bullet tracks, the views in the validation window can now be resized by clicking and dragging on the split bar between the bullet surface view and the bullet shape view. Now this allows better use to be made of the real estate that's on screen to validate bullet acquisitions. Okay, so that's pretty much all of the new features that I wanted to show you in terms of the version 3.2. What we'll do is we'll take a look at some of those questions that you've been asking, and I'm going to mute my microphone for a moment while I take a look, and we'll be right back. Okay, so just a few questions there, folks, that we'd like to get to. The first one there, for large sample sizes, how is the normalized score calculated? So the normalized scores, they're kind of calculated using statistical methods applied to the entire distribution of scores across that sample size. So that's how basically you get those normalized scores, is it takes all of the native scores and it uses the entire distribution, and then using statistical methods, a normalized score is extracted based on that. And that's why with less than 250 exhibits in your sample size, you won't get meaningful normalized scores, or you won't get normalized scores that are of the magnitude that would be allowing the exhibit to separate itself from the rest of the pack. Right, so next question is, after the existing upgrade, will existing correlation results automatically display unified scores? So yes, when the upgrade takes place, the new algorithm will apply to all the correlations on the correlation request screen. The difference is here that for the existing correlation requests that have already been processed on your system, the normalization will only take place on the returned results. So if you had a sample size of like 5,000 and your return results were 500, the normalization will only take place on the 500 returned results. If you wanted to generate a new correlation request across all 5,000, you would have to recorrelate that exhibit or generate a manual correlation request for that exhibit. And just one other one here. If I have the old nano focus bullet tracks, will I get the new interface you explained? No, the GUI, the improvements to the acquisition wizard, that's for the new 2019 bullet tracks. Okay, I think that was all the questions that we had in the chat box for now. So I've just got a couple more things to cover here. Before we get you out of here, let's look at some of these new resources that we have. We'll do one quick poll question. So how would you describe the firing pin impression pictured? Would you say it's rimfire circle, rimfire rectangle? Maybe you'd say it could be described as both rimfire circle and rectangle. So I'm going to mute for, again, just 20 seconds or so to give you a chance to answer. Okay, so looking at the results there, we've got just under a quarter who would say rimfire rectangle, 1/3 of you would say rimfire circle, and 43% would say not sure. So the exhibit that we've seen on screen there, okay, there we go. All right. So sorry, just to recap the last couple of slides there. Basically, this document kind of goes through all of those irregular firing pin impressions. So from your old Glock Gen 1 through 4s to the new Glock Gen 5s, rectangular, Springfield XDS 45 with the long kind of rectangular firing pin impression, the new Springfield XD Model 2, which can be elliptical or circular in nature, and the Sig Sauer P365, which has a wedge firing pin shape, which leaves this kind of crescent shaped impression. It's a handy reference document to have, especially if you come across these kinds of exhibits infrequently and you need a little reminder of how to handle them. You'll find it and lots more on the e-learning site. So you should have received email credentials by, login credentials by email rather. If you can't find that email, get in touch with us and we'll resend it. Once you're logged in, there are training courses on all IBIS equipment, as well as on cartridge case triage and on Firearms 101. There's also links to webinars such as this one, the how-to videos, user documentation, and virtual classrooms, which may be familiar to anyone who has taken training since the pandemic. Also worth to visit is the news section of our website, where we post press releases, details of upcoming events, blog posts, webinars, success stories, and so on. There's a webinar coming up on April 6th comparing the efficiency of the new quantum 3D microscope to a conventional comparison microscope, and also keep an eye on our social media channels for regular updates. Okay, so that's it, everybody. Thank you very much for your time today and for your questions. I think that's about it as far as the questions. We will post this online, so you will get a chance if you want to share it with some colleagues who weren't able to join us today. Please take the time to complete the short survey that follows, and don't hesitate to contact us if you have any other questions. So thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye for now.